The first thing I noticed when we crossed into coalition space was the silence on the comms channel. Not the silence of deep space, which is something you get used to after a few months on a long haul. This was the silence of people trying not to laugh. We had arrived. 40 ships. My 40 ships. And I use that word generously, because half of them had started their lives hauling iron ore between asteroid belts, and the other half had been decommissioned from Earth's planetary defense grid. After the unification wars left every government on the planet too, broke to maintain them. They were not elegant. They were not gleaming. They were not the kind of vessels that made visiting dignitaries stop and stare with admiration. They made people stop and stare, yes, but not with admiration. My name is Yusuf Adara, commander of the United Earth Delegation's Expeditionary Fleet, and I was standing on the bridge of the lead vessel, the Carver, watching 43 alien warships fill my view screen like a painting done by someone who had too much money and too much time. The Vreth formation alone took up half the visible docking corridor. Their ships were enormous things, layered in smooth silver plating that caught the light of the nearby star and threw it back like polished mirrors. Each vessel had weapons arrays that glowed faintly blue, even in standby mode. The engines alone on their flagship were wider than our largest ship was long. Next to them, we looked like a pile of old furniture someone had forgotten to throw away. Lieutenant Nora Whitfield stepped up beside me, coffee in hand, and looked at the same view screen without saying a word for about 10 seconds. Then she said very quietly, "They know we're here, right?" "They know," I said, "and they're not shooting, not yet." She nodded slowly and took a sip of her coffee. Good enough for me. I had served with Nora for 6 years. She had the rare ability to look at a completely terrible situation and find it moderately acceptable. It was one of the reasons I had asked for her specifically when Admiral Osi had handed me this assignment. The other reason was that she was the best tactical reader I had ever met, and I had a feeling we were going to need that. The Coalition Grand Assembly was a gathering that happened once every 8 years. Every species with a seat at the galactic table sent a delegation, a fleet, and enough ceremony to choke a star system. It was part diplomatic summit, part military display, part very expensive show of force. The idea was to remind everyone at the table who had power and who had manners. Ideally, you had both. Earth had neither, in the opinion of most of the species present. We had joined the coalition 4 years earlier, after the Vreth ambassador had reluctantly acknowledged that humanity's rapid expansion into the outer systems made us impossible to ignore. It had not been a warm welcome. The vote to admit us had passed by the narrowest possible margin, and the Vreth had been the loudest voice against it. Their argument, delivered in a speech that lasted nearly 3 hours and was broadcast to every corner of coalition space, was that humanity was too young, too reckless, too poor, and too unpredictable to be trusted at the table. They were not entirely wrong about the poor part. The comms opened and a voice came through that I had heard in recordings but never in person. It was the voice of Vreth Ambassador Sheth Ra, smooth and low, with that particular quality that very powerful beings develop when they have spent centuries never being told no. "Commander Adara," he said, "welcome to the Grand Assembly. We received confirmation of your fleet's arrival, though I confess we assumed there had been an error in the manifest. 40 vessels. We were expecting more." I kept my face very still. 40 was the number in the filing, Ambassador. "We are precise people." There was a pause. Then, very clearly, across an open channel that every delegation in the corridor could hear, Seth Ra said, "The humans have brought garbage bins." The laughter was not immediate. It came in waves, starting with the Vreth secondary staff and spreading outward through the comms channels the way fire spreads through dry grass. Some species laughed in ways that humans would recognize. Others made sounds that our translation systems flagged as humor only by context. But the meaning was universal and completely clear. We were the joke. Nora set her coffee down very carefully on the console beside her. The bridge crew, 12 people who had all heard every word of it, kept their eyes on their stations with the practiced discipline of people who had been briefed in advance on exactly this possibility, because they had been. I had told them it was coming. About 6 weeks before departure, I had sat my senior staff down in the Carver's small briefing room and told them 3 things. The first thing was that we were going to be mocked. The second thing was that mockery was not a problem. The third thing was that the only response that mattered was the one we gave 6 months from now, not the one we gave today. Nobody had argued with me. These were people who had grown up on Earth after the unification wars, in a world that had rebuilt itself out of pieces, and they did not need a speech about pride. They understood it in a deeper place than speeches could reach. I pressed the comms key and spoke back to the ambassador in the same even tone I had used before. "Thank you for the welcome, Ambassador Seth Ra. We look forward to the review ceremony. The Carver crew has been looking forward to this gathering for some time." Another pause. The kind that told me he had expected something else. Anger, maybe, embarrassment, some reaction that he could build on. He got nothing, and nothing was exactly what I intended to give him. The fleet review parade was scheduled for the following morning, and I spent the evening walking the ships, via the internal transport pods, moving from vessel to vessel the way a doctor walks a ward. Not to inspect. I had already inspected everything 100 times. I walked because I wanted my crew to see me walking, calmly, without urgency, without the tightness that people carry in their shoulders when they are afraid. On the 8th ship, a hauler that had been renamed the Meridian by her crew, I found our youngest engineer sitting cross-legged on the floor of the engine bay, surrounded by component housings and eating a bread roll. Her name was BC Okafor. She was 19 years old and she had been born in Lagos, and she had written 90% of the code that made our fleet's distributed intelligence system work. She was, in my honest opinion, the most important person in the entire 40-ship formation, though she wore no rank and carried no weapon, and her official title was Junior Systems Technician Grade 2. She looked up when I came in and did not stand. This was normal. BC had a complicated relationship with military formality that I had long ago decided was not worth correcting. "Commander," she said, "I think there might be a small problem with the resonance handshake on ships 14 through 19. Is it a problem that will matter tomorrow?" I asked. She considered this with genuine seriousness. "No," she said. "Not tomorrow, probably not for a few weeks. Fix it in a few weeks," I said. She nodded and bit into her bread roll. "They're really laughing at us," she said. It was not a complaint. It was an observation, delivered in the same tone she used to describe system readouts. "They are," I said. "Good," she said, and went back to her components. I stood there for a moment, watching her work. There was something in that one word, that single calm syllable, that told me everything I needed to know about the state of my fleet. We were ready. Not because we had polished our hulls, or upgraded our weapons to something the galaxy would recognize as impressive. We were ready because not one single person on any of those 4 fleet ships had confused the laughter with the outcome. The parade the next morning was, by any visual standard, a disaster. Ship number 7, which the crew called Old Bessie for reasons that predated my command, misfired her ceremonial thrust sequence and drifted 4 degrees off formation before the guidance system corrected her. Ship 22's external audio broadcast the wrong recording during the Earth Anthem portion of the ceremony, playing instead a 40-second clip of what our translation system identified as a traditional Kenyan folk song, which was actually not a terrible piece of music but was not what the program called for. And yes, there was a coolant leak visible from Ship 31's port side, a thin white mist bleeding into the vacuum that looked, I was told later, like our ship was sighing. The alien delegations watched all of this from their observation platforms. Some looked uncomfortable. A few looked genuinely sorry for us, which was worse than the laughter. The Vreth contingent did not bother to hide their reaction at all. Seth Raw stood on the primary observation deck with his secondary staff arranged behind him, and he watched our ships pass with the expression of someone watching a building fall down in slow motion. I stood at the front of our own observation platform, hands behind my back, and I watched my fleet pass with the exact same expression I would have worn if those ships had been the finest warships ever built by human hands. After the parade, as the delegations dispersed toward the assembly chambers, Admiral Osi fell into step beside me. He was a small man, compact and quiet, with the kind of stillness that came from having survived 3 wars and 1 near-total collapse of civilization on the planet he called home. He did not speak until we were away from the crowd. "Seth Ra filed a formal observation with the Coalition Assembly," he said. "He's questioning whether our fleet should be classified as a military presence at all. He's suggesting we be reclassified as a support and logistics delegation." "What does that mean practically?" I asked, though I already knew. "It means no seat at the defense table, no vote on military matters, no standing in any engagement sanctioned by the Coalition." He paused. "It means we're furniture." I nodded slowly. The corridor we were walking through was quiet, the curved walls of the station humming faintly with the sound of its own systems. "What did you tell the assembly?" Admiral Ozi looked straight ahead. "I told them we would provide a full technical briefing on our fleet's capabilities at the review board session in 3 days. He paused again, and something in his voice shifted just slightly, something that might have been, in a different man, called amusement. "I also told them we were very much looking forward to the upcoming exercises." I said nothing. I heard the same thing in his voice that I had heard in BC's one word the previous evening. He stopped walking and turned to look at me. "Let them laugh, Yusuf," he said quietly. "They haven't read our specs." I held his gaze for a moment. "No," I said, "they haven't." I had heard the Vreth valued pride above nearly everything else in the universe. They had built an empire on the idea that strength was visible, that power was something you could see, and measure and weigh. They decorated their warships with the names of battles they had won. They tracked their fleet's worth in units of currency so large that the number itself was a form of intimidation. I filed all of that away in the same place I kept information that would be useful later. It is a particular kind of patience, waiting for the right moment when everyone around you is certain you don't have one. It is not comfortable. It is not easy. But I had spent my entire career learning the difference between the moment when noise matters and the moment when silence does. And standing in that corridor, with the laughter of 17 alien species still ringing in my ears, I was absolutely certain which moment this was. We were not finished. We were not even started. We had just arrived, and no one in that station, not one single species in that gilded assembly of the powerful and the proud, had the faintest idea what 40 garbage bins could do when they thought together. The Carver had been a lot of things before I made her mine. A commercial ore hauler for the Ceres Mining Cooperative, a temporary refugee transport during the third year of the Unification Wars, a storage vessel for surplus grain in the orbit of Mars when the supply chains broke down and nobody could agree on who owned what anymore. She had 3 dents in her porthull that were there when I took command, and that I had been specifically told by the procurement office were cosmetic and therefore not a repair priority. I loved her anyway. When Admiral Ozzy had called me into his office 3 years before the Grand Assembly and told me that Earth was sending a delegation to the next coalition summit, I had sat across from him and waited for the part where he explained which real fleet I would be assigned. It took me about 4 minutes to realize there was no real fleet. There was a list of available vessels, a personnel roster pulled from active reserves and voluntary transfers, and a budget line that, when I looked at it closely, made me briefly question whether I was reading the document correctly. "This is the procurement allocation?" I asked. Osi looked at his desk. "Per vessel." I looked at the number again. $10. "Per vessel," he confirmed. I set the document down. I picked it up again. I set it down again. "Admiral," I said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You are asking me to prepare an expeditionary fleet for the Grand Assembly of the Galactic Coalition, representing the entirety of the human species on an interstellar diplomatic and military stage, with a per-vessel surplus procurement budget of $10 US. The dollar amount is a formality," he said. "The procurement designation requires a number. That was what was available in the discretionary fund at the time of filing. $10. Per vessel." I sat with this for a long moment. Outside the window of his office, the surface of the Earth was doing what it always did, turning slowly in the light, cities and oceans and the scars of old wars all visible from orbit in the pale morning. It was a remarkable planet. It had survived things that should have ended it more than once. I had always found that quietly inspiring. "All right," I said. "I'll need a full engineering roster, access to the decommissioning yards at Callisto and Phobos, and I want first pick of the available hulls before anyone else sees the list." Osi blinked. He had clearly been prepared for a different response. "That's all. And BC Okafor," I said. "She's listed as a civilian contractor on the systems project at Titan Station. I want her seconded to my command." "She's 19, he said. "I know how old she is," I said. "I've been reading her work for 2 years. He approved the transfer that same afternoon, and 3 days later I was standing in Callisto's decommissioning yard, looking at 40 ships in varying states of mechanical dignity, and a young woman in coveralls was standing next to me, eating an apple and making notes on a tablet with the focused energy of someone who had just been handed the most interesting problem they had ever seen. "The hulls are sound," BC said, not looking up from her tablet. "The engines are repairable on most of them. The navigation systems are old, but they're compatible with the new mesh protocols. The weapons hardpoints are basically scrap. We're not using the original hardpoints," I said. She looked up. "What are we using?" "Railgun components," I said. "Salvaged from the Orbital Defense Museum at Luna. And the targeting system is yours." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the 40 ships. Then she looked back at me. "You want me to write a targeting system for 40 ships? A shared targeting system?" I said. "One that runs across all 40 simultaneously." "That," she paused, searching for the word. "That's not how targeting systems work." "I know," I said. "That's why I need you to make one that does." She ate the rest of her apple in silence, looking at the ships. Then she dropped the core into a recycling bin and pulled up a new document on her tablet. "I'm going to need more processing power than any of these ships have individually," she said. "You'll have all 40, I said. She stopped walking. "You want to run a single distributed intelligence across the entire fleet?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "That's never been done. Not by us," I said. "Not by anyone as far as we know." BC chewed the inside of her cheek. It was a habit she had when she was thinking hard. The latency between ships would be the biggest problem. If the signal delay between nodes is more than about a third of a second, the system falls apart. It won't be able to make coordinated decisions fast enough. What would solve the latency problem? I asked. A new communication protocol, she said immediately. Something that compresses the decision data and sends it in microburst packets instead of continuous signal. And you'd need each ship to have local processing that can fill in the gaps during transmission windows. Can you build that? She looked at the ships again. Can I have access to all the raw processing components across all 40 hulls? Yes. And no one's going to tell me how to do it. I will tell you what I need the system to do, I said. How it does it is entirely your business. She nodded once. I'll need 6 months. She needed 4 months and 2 weeks. In that time, the rest of my crew transformed those 40 ships from the inside out. I had pulled people from every branch of Earth's military and scientific services, looking not for the most decorated or the most senior but for the ones who had the specific skill of making things work when the obvious approach was not available. There was Lieutenant Nora Whitfield, who had spent 3 years as a naval tactician and 2 more as a competitive simulation programmer before returning to active service. There was Chief Engineer Calvin Dodd, who had rebuilt a fusion drive using parts from 3 different failed prototypes during the second year of the Unification Wars, and who had a personal philosophy that could be summarized as nothing is broken, it just needs to be thought about differently. There was Dr. Petra Lamb, our systems physicist, who had published 2 papers on distributed processing architecture before she turned 30, and who had a habit of laughing at problems that made other people go pale. Together, with a total per-vessel discretionary budget of $10 each, they turned 40 cargo haulers into something the galaxy had never encountered before. The weapons were not conventional. We had stripped the old hardpoints and replaced them with compact railgun assemblies, built from components that were technically retired from service, which meant they were no longer under the standard use restrictions that applied to active military hardware. They were not the most powerful weapons in the galaxy. They were precise, low signature, and extremely difficult to track. They left almost no energy bloom on enemy sensors, which meant that by the time a target detected an incoming round, the round was already past the point where any evasive maneuver could help. The propulsion system had been reimagined by Calvin in a way that made our ships look, to any standard sensor array, like vessels running at about 60% capacity. This was deliberate. The actual performance ceiling was considerably higher, but broadcasting that would have made us a target for scrutiny. Old ships running slow were invisible. Nobody paid attention to what they expected to see. But the heart of everything, the thing that made all of it possible and coherent and lethal, was BC's system. She had started with a core framework she called the Mesh. The name was plain and descriptive and exactly like her. The Mesh was a distributed intelligence platform that ran across all 40 ships simultaneously, treating them not as 40 separate units but as a single organism with 40 bodies. Each ship contributed its processing power to a shared cognitive pool. Decisions that would have taken a single ship's computer several seconds to calculate could be solved across the Mesh in fractions of that time. Because 40 sets of processors were working on the problem in parallel, the tactical implications were significant. When the Mesh was fully active, the fleet did not respond to threats the way conventional naval formations did. Conventional tactics involved central command issuing orders, ships receiving and executing those orders, and the inevitable time delay between each step. The Mesh eliminated the delay. When a threat appeared, all 40 ships already knew about it at the same moment, and the response was not 40 individual reactions but one seamless coordinated movement, the way a school of fish turns in the ocean, every individual moving as part of the whole without any single fish giving an order. BC had trained the Mesh on data, an enormous amount of data, military history, tactical simulations, physics models, navigation records, and then, on her own initiative, which I only found out about 3 weeks before departure, she had fed it 12 million hours of human competitive gaming data. I called her into my office when I found out. She sat across from me with the expression she wore when she was confident she was right but uncertain whether I would agree. "Explain it to me," I said. "Competitive gaming is adversarial decision-making under time pressure," she said. "The players who reach the highest levels are the ones who can read patterns faster than their opponents and break out of predictable behavior when necessary. The Mesh needed to be unpredictable. Standard military training data teaches patterns. Gaming data teaches pattern breaking." I looked at her for a long moment. "And you think this works?" "I know it works," she said. "I tested it in simulation against every known alien combat doctrine in our database. Against Vreth standard formation tactics, the Mesh achieves disengagement or neutralization in under 40 minutes in 93% of scenarios." "What about the other 7%? I asked. She tilted her head slightly. Those are the scenarios where we are outnumbered more than 6-1 with no room to maneuver. I couldn't find a way to solve those. Fair, I said. There's one other thing, she said. She paused. And for the first time in the conversation, she looked genuinely uncertain. Commander, I think I accidentally made it too smart. I had heard a lot of things in my career. That sentence was a new one. Explain too smart, I said. The mesh learns in real time, she said. It was supposed to learn slowly, updating its tactical models over the course of days and weeks. But the gaming data changed the architecture. It's learning on a much faster cycle, in a real engagement, against real adversaries. It will begin adapting to their specific patterns within the first few minutes of contact. By 10 minutes in, it will have built a predictive model of their behavior that's more accurate than anything our analysts could produce manually. I sat with this for a moment. That sounds like a feature, I said finally. She let out a breath. That's what I decided too, she said. I just wanted to take sure you agreed. It's the most human sentence I've ever heard, I told her. We made something better than we meant to, and then we're worried about it. Welcome to every important invention in history. She smiled at that. It was a quick, small smile, but it was real. The weeks before departure were full. There were drills, not the kind that looked impressive on a parade ground, but the kind that built the instincts a crew needed when things went sideways. There were engineering sessions where Calvin's team opened and reopened the same components, until the work was not just done correctly but done automatically, by muscle memory, in the dark, with one hand. There were long sessions where I sat with Nora going over every piece of intelligence we had on alien fleet tactics, not to copy them but to understand the assumptions behind them, because assumptions were always where the gaps were. And there were evenings. I spent a lot of them walking the ships. It was a habit I had developed early in my career and never broken. Commanders who stayed on the bridge learned to see their fleet as data. Commanders who walked their ships learned to see it as people, and people were the only thing that actually mattered when everything else broke down. On the Meridian, I found Calvin rebuilding a secondary coolant line that technically did not need rebuilding for another 2 months, because he wanted to be certain. On the Porter, I found the navigation crew running practice approaches to the Coalition docking corridor, using nothing but manual control. No guidance assist, just in case. On a small hauler near the end of the formation that her crew called the Penny because the name felt right for a ship that had cost roughly that, I found 3 junior crew members who had stayed up past shift end to run combat simulations. Not because anyone had told them to, but because they wanted to be ready. This was who we were, not the ships, not the specs. Not the $10 budget line that an administrator somewhere had entered into a form without understanding what it would become. We were the people who had been handed the worst tools available and had refused, completely and without drama, to treat that as a reason to fail. I had heard plenty of speeches in my life about human resilience and human ingenuity. I had heard them from politicians and generals and diplomats and teachers. Most of the time they were fine words describing a fine idea. But walking those ships in the weeks before departure, seeing what my crew had done with nothing, I did not need the words. I could see what the idea looked like when it was real. It looked like Calvin's rebuilt coolant line. It looked like BC's 12 million hours of gaming data. It looked like Nora's simulation runs at 2 in the morning when she was technically off duty. It looked like 40 ships that the galaxy had dismissed before we even left port, crewed by people who had not dismissed themselves for even one moment. 3 days before departure, we ran a full mesh activation test for the first time. All 40 ships, all systems live, full integration. I stood on the Carver's Bridge and watched the status board as each ship came online one by one, green lights building across the display like stars appearing at dusk, until all 40 were connected, and the board showed a single unified system, status that I had never seen before on any military display I had ever operated. One fleet, one mind, 40 bodies. BC's voice came over the comms from the Meridian where she had set up her primary workstation. Mesh integration complete, she said. All nodes responsive. Latency within tolerance across all channels. The system is live. Nora was standing next to me. I looked at her. Well, she said, that's new. It is, I said. You think they're ready? I looked at the status board for another moment. 40 green lights. 40 ships that had been cargo haulers and ore processors and decommissioned relics, rebuilt by people who had decided that good enough was not a phrase that applied to them. 40 nodes of a single intelligence that had been trained on the entirety of human military knowledge. And 12 million hours of competitive gaming, data written by a teenager who thought in ways that no existing tactical manual could describe. They were ready before I got here, I said. I just had to catch up. 2 days later we departed for the Grand Assembly, and the galaxy prepared to laugh at us, and we let it. because the laugh was the last comfortable moment the Vreth Dominion was going to have for a very long time. The Kepler-9 colony was not a large settlement, about 40,000 people, most of them miners and terraforming engineers, and the families they had brought with them into the outer systems when Earth's expansion programs began pushing past the familiar boundaries of home space. The planet was cold and rocky, and the atmosphere was still being built, which meant everyone lived in pressurized habitats that smelled like recycled air, and whatever was cooking in the communal kitchens that evening. It was not a glamorous place, but the people who lived there had chosen it deliberately, the way people always chose difficult things deliberately, because something in the choosing mattered more than the comfort they were giving up. I had visited Kepler-9 once, 2 years before the Grand Assembly. I had walked through one of the habitat corridors, and a child of about 7 had looked up at me and asked if I was a soldier. I had told her I was something like that. She had thought about this and then asked if I was going to make sure the bad things stayed away. I had told her that was exactly what I was going to try to do. I thought about her a lot after the Vreth made their move. The announcement came during the second day of the assembly sessions, delivered by Seth Ra to the full coalition chamber with the smooth confidence of someone who had rehearsed the words many times. The Vreth Dominion was formally asserting a territorial claim over the Kepler-9 system, citing historical expansion corridors that predated Earth's presence in the outer systems by several centuries. The claim was, by Vreth legal standards, technically legitimate. Ancient expansion corridor rights were recognized under Coalition Charter, even when no actual Vreth settlement existed within the claimed space. The Coalition chamber went very quiet. I was seated in the human delegation gallery, 2 rows up from the main floor, and I watched the reaction move through the room the way a ripple moves through still water. The older species, the ones who had been part of the coalition long enough to understand what a move like this meant, were careful and still. The newer member delegations looked uncertain, checking quietly with their advisors. A few species that had ongoing territorial disputes with the Vreth were watching Seth Ra with an attention that went beyond polite interest. Admiral Osi was beside me. He did not move, he did not speak. He watched the chamber floor with the same expression he used when he was calculating something complex. The Vreth claim meant, under coalition rules, that the Kepler-9 colony was now in a disputed zone. Disputed zones required a physical review presence, meaning that a fleet had to be positioned at the location while the legal process played out. It could take months. During that time, the colony's supply lines would be disrupted, expansion work would halt, and 40,000 people would be living under the shadow of a Vreth territorial assertion that everyone in that chamber understood was not really about ancient corridors at all. It was about showing the newer members what power looked like when it was applied with patience. After the session, the Coalition Defense Committee met in a smaller room off the main chamber. I was not invited to that meeting. Osi was, and I waited for 2 hours in a narrow corridor outside, watching other delegation staff move back and forth with the focused energy of people managing a situation they had not expected. When Osi came out, his face was arranged in the specific neutral expression he used when the news was bad and he was deciding how to deliver it. "They've assigned us to the review position," he said. "I had expected this. Alone?" "The committee determined that a coalition multi-species presence would escalate tensions," he said. "One delegation. A diplomatic review posture, not a combat deployment." He paused. The Vreth accepted the arrangement without objection, which meant they had suggested it, or at the very least, they had worked it so that the outcome pointed in this direction. A single Earth fleet positioned at Kepler-9, officially there in a diplomatic capacity, completely without the backing of coalition military support if something happened. If the Vreth chose to move on the colony directly, we would be positioned as witnesses, not defenders, unless we chose to be something else. "Has anyone spoken to the colony?" I asked. "The governor was notified an hour ago," Osi said. "She requested an Earth military presence. She was told we were providing one." He looked at me steadily. "She doesn't know what that means yet." I thought about 40,000 people in pressurized habitats. I thought about a 7-year-old asking if I was going to keep the bad things away. "When do we depart?" "Tuesday," Osi said. That gave me 4 days. It was enough. The Vreth response came within the hour. Marshal Sarath, the Vreth military commander who had arrived at the assembly aboard their flagship with an escort of 12 warships, sent a direct channel communication address to me personally. This was not standard protocol. Direct communications were supposed to go through the Coalition Liaison Office, and sending one without that channel was a small but deliberate signal that Sarath did not consider the standard process worth observing when dealing with us. I read the message 3 times. It said in full, "Commander Adara." We are aware of the Coalition's decision to assign your fleet to the Kepler 9 position. We welcome your presence. We recommend you send your trash ships ahead. We will return them as scrap. Consider it a kindness. I printed the message. I folded the paper. I put it in my shirt pocket. Then I called a full fleet staff meeting. The Carver's main briefing room was not large enough for all the senior crew, from 40 ships, so we ran it as a linked session, my room physical and every other ship joining via the internal comms network. I could see them all on the row of small screens along the side wall, faces in tiny squares, some already in work clothes, some still in their off-duty gear, all of them attentive in the way that told me the word had already moved through the fleet informally before the official meeting even started. I did not give a speech. I had never liked speeches, and I did not believe in them for this kind of moment. I told them what the situation was, clearly and without ornamentation. 40,000 civilians in a disputed zone, a Vreth fleet of significant size already positioned in the outer system, a coalition that had placed us in a position where we were, officially, only there to observe. What about unofficially? Nora asked. She was in the room with me, and she asked the question without any particular emphasis, the way she asked most things. Unofficially, I said, we're a military fleet and Kepler 9 is a human colony. Those are the two facts that matter when the other ones run out. Nobody asked any follow-up questions about that. I moved to the tactical section of the briefing. Nora had spent the previous 2 days compiling everything available on Vreth fleet doctrine, and she pulled in data from coalition records that covered 1,200 years of Vreth military history. It was a lot of information about a species that had been winning wars since before humanity had invented the wheel, and it painted a consistent picture. The Vreth fought with spectacle. Their doctrine was built around the visible display of overwhelming force, because they had discovered early in their military history that a large enough demonstration of power often ended a conflict before it began. Their formations were designed to be impressive from a distance. Their weapon systems were calibrated for maximum sensor bloom, so that anyone watching them fire would see an unmistakable and terrifying light show. Their fleet movements were precise and coordinated and, after 1,200 years, deeply patterned. Pattern was the word I kept coming back to. They know how to fight everything they've ever fought, Nora said, pulling up a summary chart on the room's main display. And they fight everything the same way. Overwhelming force, central command structure, formation discipline that depends on every ship knowing exactly where every other ship is at all times. She paused. They have never in recorded history fought a distributed, swarm intelligence. Because nobody's ever had one, said Calvin, from his screen on the side wall. Exactly, said Nora. BC was on one of the screens. Her expression focused in the way it got when she was already running calculations in the background. The mesh will need approximately 8 minutes of contact time before it has a sufficiently accurate predictive model of their formation behavior, she said. During those 8 minutes we are more vulnerable than we will be afterward. What does vulnerable mean in practical terms? I asked. It means they can hit us, she said flatly. After 8 minutes they cannot. I looked around the room, the physical part of it, and the screens. 8 minutes, I said. That's what we need to survive. After that, we're fighting a different kind of battle than anything they've ever encountered. Calvin cleared his throat. The coolant issue on ships 14 through 19 has been resolved, he said. I also want to note that I have run the engine stress tests on all 40 hulls, and every one of them is performing above the spec we logged with the Coalition. When they scan us, they will see what the spec says. What they won't see is the actual ceiling. Good, I said. I also want to mention, he added, that I stayed up most of last night doing something I probably should have done 3 years ago. What's that? I asked. I fixed the ceremonial thrust sequence on Ship 7, he said. Old Bessie won't drift anymore. A few people on the screen smiled. A few others laughed. It was a small moment of warmth in a room full of serious faces, and I let it sit for a moment before I moved on. Dr. Petra Lamb was on the screen furthest to the right, and she had been quiet through most of the meeting. She spoke now. I want to say one thing, she said, and then I'm done. Everyone waited. The Vreth have been winning wars for 1,200 years, she said. That's a very long time. Long enough that they've started to believe the winning is about them. About who they are. About their ships and their weapons and their formations and the size of their engines. She paused. It's not about any of that. It never was. They've just never met anyone who could show them the difference. The room was quiet after that. I waited one beat. Tuesday, I said. Full mesh readiness by Monday night. I want every ship dialed in before we jump. People began to sign off. Screens went dark one by one. I stayed in the room after everyone else had left, reading over Nora's tactical summary one more time, and then I took the folded paper out of my shirt pocket. Consider it a kindness. I set it on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then I picked up the comms handset and opened a direct channel to the Vreth liaison office. I dictated a single line. Commander Adara to Marshal Sereth. We'll be there Tuesday. No threats, no counter-message, no posturing or display of any kind. Just the day of the week. I was told later, by a coalition liaison officer who had heard about it secondhand, that Sereth's staff had spent an hour trying to determine whether the brevity of the reply indicated resignation, incompetence, or some form of diplomatic code they were missing. It was none of those things. It was simply the truth, offered plainly, from a person who had no need to dress it up. We would be there Tuesday. That was all he needed to know. I slept better than I had in months that night. Not because I wasn't aware of what was coming. I was aware of every detail of it, in the precise and complete way that I had spent my career learning to be. I slept well because I had looked at everything available, and I understood, with the clean certainty that comes from thorough preparation, that we were as ready as it was possible to be. Not invincible, never that, but ready. And readiness, I had learned a long time ago, was the only honest form of confidence there was. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel, directly into the middle of the Vreth formation. Not at the edge of the system, where a fleet arriving for a diplomatic review was supposed to emerge. Not at a safe distance with shields up and comms open and the standard arrival. We came out of FTL inside their perimeter, 40 ships materializing into real space with the Vreth fleet surrounding us on 3 sides before a single alarm had time to sound. It was not a navigation error. Every sensor alert across the Vreth formation lit up simultaneously. I could see their ships begin to shift, the elegant choreography of a force that had spent centuries drilling the same response to unexpected contact. Their formation tightened. Their weapons arrays came to life, the familiar blue glow of Vreth energy systems brightening across a dozen hulls at once. On the comms channel, I could hear fragments of Vreth tactical chatter that our translation system was working through in real time, the fast, dense language of a command structure that had just received a surprise and was not accustomed to surprises. Mesh activation, I said. BC's voice came back immediately. Mesh is live, all 40 nodes responsive, integration complete. On the tactical display in front of me, the fleet stopped looking like 40 ships and started looking like one organism. The mesh was awake. The Vreth flagship, a vessel so large that it had its own internal gravity systems and a crew count that we estimated at over 4,000, turned toward us. Marshal Sereth's voice came over the open channel within seconds. He was not shouting. The Vreth did not shout in combat. Their communication style under pressure was clipped and precise, the product of a culture that associated noise with weakness. Commander Adara, he said, you have entered a restricted formation zone. You will hold your position and prepare for boarding inspection. Nora was at the tactical console to my left, and she looked at me with the small, steady expression she wore when she was paying very close attention. I shook my head almost imperceptibly. No response yet. The Vreth formation continued to tighten. They were performing a standard enclosure pattern, a maneuver designed to surround and immobilize, and they were doing it with the precision of a species that had executed it thousands of times over centuries of conflict. From the outside, watching them on the display, it was genuinely impressive. The geometry was beautiful in the cold mechanical way that truly well-drilled military formations could be beautiful. The problem was that the mesh had already seen it. 8 seconds after we dropped out of FTL, the mesh began modeling the Vreth formation behavior, not guessing, modeling, building a dynamic predictive map of where each Vreth ship would be at each moment of the next several minutes, based on the patterns it was observing in real time, and cross-referencing against 1,200 years of Vreth tactical doctrine. At 2 minutes of contact, the mesh had a preliminary model. At 5 minutes, the model was refined enough to be operationally useful. At 8 minutes, BC said very quietly, "It has them." That was all she said. She did not need to say more. The mesh had built its predictive picture. From this point forward, the Vreth formation was transparent to us in a way that no amount of sensor technology could have achieved by conventional means. We did not know where their ships were. We knew where their ships were going to be. There is a profound difference. Sereth spoke again. His voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something that the translation system flagged as increased tension in the vocal register. Commander, this is your final advisory. Cease all movement and prepare for inspection. I pressed the comms key. Marshal Sereth, I said. We're here for the Kepler 9 review as assigned by the Coalition Defense Committee. We're just getting settled. A pause. You are inside our security perimeter. We dropped a little close, I said. Older guidance systems, I'm sure you understand. Another pause. Longer this time. Then the Vreth flagship fired. It was not a ranging shot. The Vreth did not do ranging shots. They fired at full capacity, Because they believed that the appropriate opening statement in any conflict was the clearest possible demonstration of what you were capable of. The energy beam that came from their primary weapon array was the most powerful single-directed energy output I had personally witnessed in my career. A bolt of compressed plasma so bright that it washed out our visual sensors for nearly a full second. It hit nothing. The mesh had moved the fleet, not fast in the visible dramatic way of a vessel dodging a projectile. The movement was almost calm. A 40-ship formation adjusting its position in a way that looked, on visual sensors, almost like a slow drift. But the drift was precisely calculated, and the Vreth weapon had been fired at the position where the mesh had predicted their targeting solution was. Aimed, not at the position our ships actually occupied. We were already somewhere else. The Vreth formation hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but it was there. A trained force encountering an unexpected result, taking a moment to reassess. The mesh did not hesitate. What happened next was unlike anything I had seen in simulation, and the simulations had been remarkable. The 40 ships of our fleet began to move in ways that had no precedent in naval doctrine, because they had not been designed by naval doctrine. The mesh was drawing on 12 million hours of competitive pattern data, and what it produced was a movement language that had nothing to do with traditional fleet formations. Ships peeled off in directions that seemed arbitrary until the results made them obvious. Angles of approach appeared from positions the Vreth formation had considered protected. The fleet's shape changed continuously, never holding the same configuration for more than a few seconds, so that any targeting solution the Vreth computed was obsolete before it could be executed. From the bridge of the Carver it felt strangely calm. The mesh was doing the coordinating. Our crew were managing ship-level systems, watching readouts, executing the specific local commands that the mesh routed to each vessel. Nora was monitoring the tactical overview with the focused, quiet attention of someone watching something remarkable happen and making sure it stayed on track. The Vreth fired 11 more times in the first 4 minutes. They hit nothing. Their formation began to break from the standard enclosure pattern. This was not a sign of panic. The Vreth did not panic. It was a tactical adaptation, the kind of retraining in contact that any experienced force would attempt. They recognized that their standard approach was not producing results, and they began shifting to alternate doctrines. I watched the tactical display as their formation evolved, the ships rearranging into patterns that coalition records identified as their more advanced combat geometries, maneuvers reserved for opponents who had survived the initial engagement. The mesh adapted faster than they changed. Every new formation the Vreth attempted had already been modeled and countered by the time it was half executed. The predictive architecture had enough data now that it was not just tracking current behavior. It was anticipating the decisions behind the behavior, reading the logic of the commanders making the choices, and projecting what the next choice would be before it was made. I had known this was possible. I had read BC's technical notes. I had understood the theory. Watching it in practice was something different. It was like watching a conversation where one side was always 2 sentences ahead. "Commander," Calvin said from the engineering station, "ships 12 and 31 are showing increased stress on their forward railgun mounts. The mesh is using them more than the load tolerance recommends. Can they hold?" I asked. "For another 20 minutes, yes. The engagement will be over before then," I said. He looked at his readout. "You sound very certain." "The mesh is certain," I said. "I'm just reporting what it says." At the 11-minute mark, the mesh executed the move that BC had described in her theoretical models but had never been able to test in simulation because no simulation could adequately model a real opponent's real panic. It was not a single dramatic action. It was a sequence, a threading motion that moved 15 ships through gaps in the Vreth formation simultaneously, each ship passing so close to a Vreth vessel that the standard proximity alarms triggered on both sides, and then holding those positions with the Vreth ships between them and the rest of the Vreth fleet. A formation that was supposed to surround us had somehow been turned inside out. The Vreth weapons went silent, not because they had stopped wanting to fire, because their own ships were in the way. I opened the comms channel. "Marshal Sareth," I said, "we need to talk about Kepler 9. His response took 16 seconds. In tactical terms, 16 seconds is a very long time. "What are you doing?" he said. The clipped precision was still there in his voice, but the thing underneath it had changed. It was not tension anymore. It was something closer to the sound a mind makes when it encounters something it cannot fit into any category it already has. "We're negotiating," I said pleasantly. "I believe that is one of the purposes of a diplomatic review. You are inside our formation." "I know." It seemed like the most direct way to have a conversation. Another pause. "This is not a recognized tactical doctrine." "No, it's new." The Vreth secondary fleet, 12 ships that had been positioned at the edge of the system, and which had been moving toward the engagement at standard tactical speed since the first shots were fired, was now approximately 6 minutes away from range. The mesh had been tracking them the entire time. Nora showed me the projected intercept calculation without commentary, and I looked at it for a moment. BC, I said on the internal channel. Already on it, she said. I've sent the approach vectors to ships 20 through 35. They'll be in intercept position before the secondaries arrive. Can we handle both groups simultaneously, I asked. Yes, she said. But I want to flag something. Go ahead. The mesh has identified a pattern in the secondary fleet's approach that suggests they're following a predetermined script. The movement isn't adaptive. It's a procedure they were given before this engagement started, and they're executing it regardless of what's happening here. A brief pause. They don't know we've already neutralized the primary formation. I thought about this. So they're coming in expecting to arrive at the end of a finished fight. Yes, and if we handle them the same way we handled the primary group, the entire Vreth force in this system will be neutralized within about 8 minutes. Of their arrival, no losses on our side. I sat with the tactical picture for a moment. The Vreth primary formation, unable to fire without hitting their own ships. The secondary group, moving on autopilot toward a situation they did not yet understand. 40,000 civilians on Kepler 9, in their pressurized habitats waiting. I want to change the approach, I said. Nora looked at me. We are not going to destroy anything, I said. No hull breaches, no casualties. I want navigation arrays, communication systems, and weapons charging cores only. Everything else stays intact. That's a more precise target list, Nora said carefully. The mesh can handle it, but it'll take longer. How much longer? She checked her display. 8 minutes versus 4. Then it takes 8 minutes, I said. The approach was everything I had asked for, and nothing that Sareth could have planned a response to, because it was not the kind of thing that any force in the galaxy planned to defend against. Destroying a fleet was something every warfaring civilization had doctrines for. Having your fleet carefully, specifically, and completely taken apart by a force that was making absolutely certain none of your crew were harmed was not something that appeared in any tactical manual. The Vreth ships one by one went dark, not destroyed, dark, navigation offline, communications down, weapons unable to charge. Each ship reduced to a sealed hull drifting in space, entirely intact, crew safe behind their hull plating, going nowhere and doing nothing. It took 37 minutes from the first shot to the last system going quiet. When the secondary fleet arrived, they found their primary formation drifting in a loose cloud of powerless vessels and 40 cargo haulers holding position around them with the unhurried confidence of ships that had nowhere else to be. The secondary fleet stopped, held position, made no aggressive move. I opened the broad channel that would reach every Vreth ship in the systems. Sareth, I said, your fleet is not damaged. Your crew are not injured. Your ships will be fully operational again once you dispatch technical teams for the navigation and communication systems, which I estimate will take about 3 days. I paused. The Coalition Defense Committee will be receiving a full record of this engagement. I look forward to resuming the discussion about Kepler 9 in the appropriate diplomatic setting. Silence. Then Sareth's voice, and every trace of the composed military precision was still technically there, but underneath it something had given way. The way ice gives way when the temperature has been above freezing long enough that the surface cannot hold anymore. What are you? He said. Not angry, not threatening, genuinely asking. I pressed the comms key one more time. Broke, I said, and creative the channel closed. Nora was quiet for a moment beside me. Then she said that was a good line. I've been saving it, I said. She picked up her coffee, which had somehow survived the entire engagement without spilling, and took a long sip. The mesh is already writing the engagement summary, she said. BC says it's doing it voluntarily. She didn't ask it to. Is that a problem? I asked. Apparently not. She says it's just thorough. Pause. She also says it included recommendations for 3 tactical improvements it identified during the engagement. I looked at the tactical display, at 40 dark Vreth ships and 40 green lights representing our own fleet, all present and undamaged. Tell her I'll read them. She already assumed you would, Nora said. She sent them to your queue 20 minutes ago. I sat back in my command chair and looked at the view screen and the quiet stars beyond it and the gentle drift of the most powerful fleet in the Vreth Dominion going nowhere at all. Outside, Kepler 9 turned slowly in the light of its star, cold and rocky and alive. 40,000 people going about their lives in pressurized habitats that smelled like recycled air, and whatever was cooking in the communal kitchens that evening. The bad things had stayed away. That was enough. The Grand Assembly Chamber was the same room it had always been. The same curved walls, the same graduated seating arrangements, The same quality of light that felt both warm and slightly clinical. The way all large official spaces feel when they are designed to impress without committing to any particular emotion. But it was not the same room. I noticed it from the moment I walked in. Not in anything that anyone said, because very little was being said yet. In the way people moved, and where they were looking, and the particular quality of attention that a room takes on when something has changed the coordinates of everything. We had been back at the assembly station for 4 days. The Vreth had not yet returned. Sareth and his fleet were still technically in transit from the Kepler-9 system, their faster-than-light capability fully restored, but their schedule, I suspected, being managed by a diplomatic team who understood that arriving too quickly after what had happened would require them to have something to say. Nobody was laughing. This was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the chamber and found my seat in the human delegation gallery. 17 alien delegations were present, in the various forms of arrival and preparation that preceded a formal session. The Zathara were settled in their crystalline formation in the upper tier. As always, the Brellan contingent occupied their low-gravity alcoves along the east wall, moving through the slow liquid motions that characterize their physiology under standard atmosphere. The Karath were present, and the Dolven, and the 11 other species who had seats at the galactic table, all of them doing the things they normally did before a session began. None of them were looking at us the way they had looked at us 6 days ago. Nora was beside me, and I heard her make a small sound that was not quite a word, a quiet exhale of recognition that told me she had noticed it too. The session was formally called to order by the assembly chair, a Zathara diplomat named Irith Sovel, who had held the position for 11 years and who had the impressive skill of being completely neutral in every visible way regardless of what was happening around her. She read the agenda. The Vreth territorial claim was third on the list. Before it came 2 routine items, a shipping lane designation and a resource extraction agreement, both of which were handled without difficulty. When the Kepler-9 item was called, Irith Sovel read the situation summary that had been filed by the Coalition Liaison Office, the assignment of the human delegation fleet to the review position, the engagement that had taken place, the current status of the Vreth fleet, and the fact that no coalition forces other than the human contingent had been involved. She read all of this in the same measured voice she used for shipping lane designations. Then she invited comment from the floor. What followed was not a debate. It was something more like a reckoning, the quiet kind that happens when a large group of people who have all privately held the same understanding suddenly find themselves in a room where that understanding can be acknowledged publicly for the first time. The Karath ambassador spoke first. He was a tall, slow-moving being whose species communicated through layered speech, multiple meanings carried simultaneously in harmonics. The translation came through in sequence. He said that the coalition's commitment to diplomatic resolution was important, and that he had confidence in the review process. He said that the engagement report had been reviewed by the Karath Defense Council, and that several elements of it had been described by those analysts as, and here the translation system paused for a fraction of a second as it processed the harmonic layering, unprecedented in the operational record. He did not look at our gallery when he said it. He did not need to. The Dolven representative, a small species who communicated primarily through chemical signal, that their translation nodes converted to audio, said that the Dolven had historically supported measured response to territorial assertion, and that the record of the Kepler-9 engagement reflected a remarkably measured response, all things considered. There was something in the phrasing of measured that landed in the room with weight, because the Dolven were known as a precise species who chose their words with exceptional care. Several other delegations offered comments in a similar vein, not effusive, not dramatic, the kind of careful, formally phrased acknowledgement that galactic diplomacy used when it wanted to say something important in a way that everyone would understand and nobody would have to quote later. Through all of it, I sat in my gallery and listened and did not speak. Osi was 2 seats to my right, and he too was quiet. This was his element, the long game, and he had been playing it for longer than I had been a soldier. After the formal session ended, the chamber dissolved into the informal conversations that always filled the space between agenda items and actual work. I was standing near the outer corridor when the first approach came. It was not Seth Ra. He would come eventually, I knew, but not today. Today it was Ambassador Hrelavori of the Brellan contingent, a species that Earth had only limited diplomatic contact with but that had significant strategic importance because of their positioning in the inner coalition systems. Hrelavori moved in the slow liquid way of his species, unhurried, stopping beside me with the comfortable ease of someone who had decided in advance that this conversation was going to be relaxed. He had 4 vocal membranes and his translated voice was a pleasant deep resonance. "Commander Adara," he said, "I hope the Kepler 9 assignment was not too disruptive to your crew's schedule." I recognized the tone. This was not small talk. It was the opening of a different kind of conversation, and the casualness was deliberate and professional. "Not at all," I said. "We were glad to be useful." "Yes," he said. A pause that was just slightly longer than conversational. The engagement summary was distributed to all Defense Council channels within the first day. There was considerable discussion. "I hope it was useful reading," I said. "The distributed intelligence architecture was of particular interest," he said. He was not looking at me while he spoke, which was a Brellan conversational convention that indicated the topic was the important thing, not the personal exchange. Several of our analysts had questions about the operational parameters, the latency management, specifically. The way the system maintains coherence across 40 nodes without a central command processor. I said nothing for a moment. I was thinking about what BC would say if I told her that the Brellan Defense Council had read her work. "I'm glad it attracted attention," I said carefully. "It was developed by a member of our engineering team." "Yes," Relavori said. "A young woman from Lagos, according to the personnel record attached to the filing." He paused. "The Brellan Scientific Council would be very interested in an exchange program. At the appropriate time. I'll note the interest," I said. He nodded in his slow, deliberate way. "The Brellan contingent voted against human membership 4 years ago," he said. "It was offered without apology or embarrassment, as a plain fact. I believed at the time that the coalition was admitting a species that was not yet ready for the responsibilities of full membership." I waited. "I have revised this assessment," he said. He looked at me then, directly, the 4 membranes shifting slightly in a way that the translation node labeled as earnest. "I would appreciate the opportunity to say so formally, if the appropriate moment arises." He moved away into the crowd after that, and I stood where I was for a moment. Over the following 2 days, I had 11 similar conversations. Some were more direct, some were more careful. Some came from species whose names I had only encountered in coalition databases and who now sought me out specifically, through liaison staff or direct approach, to discuss things that ranged from tactical exchange agreements to trade proposals to quiet but unmistakable expressions of respect. The Kareth sent a formal inquiry about the railgun assembly design. The Zethera, whose communication style tended toward poetry and metaphor, sent a message through their formal channel that described our fleet as the hidden current beneath the visible wave, which their cultural attaché translated for me as high praise from a species that used ocean metaphors for the things they admired most. I answered all of them, forwarded the appropriate requests to OC's diplomatic team, and tried not to let any of it alter the fundamental state of mind that had gotten us here in the first place. BC, when I told her about the Brellan interest, was in the engine bay of the Meridian doing something to a component housing that involved 3 different tools and a level of focused attention that I recognized as deep creative engagement. She looked up when I finished telling her, and the expression on her face was one I had not seen from her before. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride. "An exchange program?" she said. "That's what he said." She was quiet for a moment. "I would like that," she said. Then she went back to her component. That evening, I found myself sitting in the Carver's observation lounge, a small room at the rear of the ship that nobody used for anything official because it was too small and the view was blocked on one side by a docking port housing. But it had a porthole window that faced away from the station, and through it you could see open space, the particular depth of it that never quite stopped being remarkable, no matter how many years you spent out here. I was thinking about Seth Ra. He had returned to the station that afternoon, quietly, through a secondary docking port, rather than the main arrival corridor. There had been no announcement of his return. His staff had filed the appropriate notifications through the coalition liaison channels, and that was all. The Vreth delegation had taken their usual seats in the assembly chamber for the evening session without fanfare, and Seth Ra had sat at the center of their gallery, with the composed immobility of a person who had decided that composure was the only available armor. I had not approached him, I had not acknowledged him across the chamber. The next move in this particular conversation was his, and I was patient. He came to find me the following morning. I was in one of the station's smaller conference rooms, working through the technical exchange documentation with OC's team, when a liaison officer knocked and told me that the Vreth ambassador was requesting a private meeting. I told the team to take a break and had them bring him in. Seth Ra was not a small being. The Vreth were generally tall, and he was on the taller side even for his species. And in the small conference room, he had the quality of something that belonged in a larger space. He sat across the table from me, and he was still the same composed, smooth, silver-scaled diplomat I had watched laugh at our fleet a week earlier. but something in the architecture of his composure had shifted. A structural change, not visible in any single feature but present in the whole, the way a building can look the same after a foundation has been altered. He said, "Commander Adara, I requested this meeting without going through the formal liaison channels because I wanted to speak to you directly." "I understand," I said. "I intend to withdraw the Vreth territorial claim on the Kepler-9 system," he said. "This will be announced in the formal session this afternoon. I wanted you to hear it from me before the announcement." I nodded once. "Thank you for telling me." A pause. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at me. "I reviewed the full engagement record," he said. "Our internal analysis, the independent coalition filing, every available data point." Another pause. "I have been a military commander for 40 years. I have fought 11 campaigns. I have a record that my government considers distinguished." He stopped there for a moment, and I waited. "I have never encountered a tactical system that behaved the way yours did," he said. "Our analysts have been attempting to model it since the engagement ended, and they cannot reproduce its decision architecture. The movements your fleet made should not have been possible for a formation of that size without a centralized command structure, and your ships made them without any detectable command delay." He looked at me steadily. "Our analysts are not unintelligent beings. They have been studying military tactics for longer than your species has been in space. They cannot explain what they saw." I considered how to answer this. "I can tell you how it works," I said, "in general terms. We built a distributed intelligence system that treats all 40 ships as a single processing unit. The tactical decisions are made by that combined intelligence, rather than by any individual commander." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you build such a system?" "With scavenged components," I said, "and a very talented young engineer who was willing to approach the problem, without any assumptions about how it was supposed to work." He absorbed this. "The cost of your fleet," he said. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "The coalition filing listed a per-vessel procurement allocation that our financial analysts flagged as a data entry error." "It was not a data entry error," I said. He looked at me. $10 per vessel," I confirmed. The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence from the ones in the assembly chamber. Those silences had the weight of collective reckoning in them. This one was personal. I watched Seth Raw sit with it, the number, the arithmetic of what it meant. The fact that the fleet which had dismantled his, in 37 minutes, had been built on a budget that would not purchase a single component from the cheapest Vreth weapons locker. "How?" he said finally. Not an accusation. A genuine question from a person who needed to understand something. I thought about how to answer. About BC in her engine bay. About Calvin's rebuilt coolant line. About the navigation crew on the Porter running manual approach drills until the skill was part of their hands. About 40,000 people in pressurized habitats on a cold, rocky world who were still there this morning because of all of it. "We didn't have the option of doing it the expensive way," I said. "So we found a way that worked with what we had. We've been doing that for our entire history. Every time, without exception." I paused. "The expensive approach builds one very impressive thing. The cheap approach, done well, builds 1,000 things that each solve one problem. And when they all work together, the result is harder to fight than the impressive thing." Seth Raw looked at me for a long time. "We underestimated you," he said. "Everyone did." I said. "We're used to it." And I stood with him. He was silent for a moment, and then he said something that I did not expect. "The young engineer from Lagos," he said. "What is her name?" "BC Okafor," I said. He nodded once formally. "Her work will be discussed in the Vreth Military Science Institute for a long time," he said. "I thought she should know that." I told him I would pass it on. He left, and I sat back down in the empty conference room and looked at the table for a while. That afternoon's session was quiet in the way that meaningful sessions often are, the important things handled without theater. Seth Raw withdrew the Kepler-9 claim in formal language that was precise and final. Several delegations noted their approval. The session moved on. Afterward, I went back to the Carver. She was still leaking coolant from port side. The dent on the hull was still there. Old Bessie, ship number 7, was docked 3 berths down the line, and I could see from where I stood that her external plating still had the scorch marks from a docking incident that had happened 2 years before I took command, and that nobody had gotten around to fixing because it was cosmetic and, therefore, not a repair priority. I walked the ships that evening, not because I needed to inspect anything, out of the habit that had served me every time before. I went to the Meridian and found BC cross-legged on the floor of the engine bay, surrounded by component housings, eating something from a tin. She looked up when I came in. "The Vreth withdrew the claim," I said. She nodded. I saw the session record. "Marshal Sareth asked me your name," I said. "He said your work would be discussed at the Vreth Military Science Institute." BC was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Is that all?" I asked. She thought about it. I mean, she said, that's nice. But I already found 3 improvements during the Kepler 9 engagement that I want to implement before the next one. The mesh's recommendations? I said. She looked at me. How did you know it was writing recommendations? Nora told me, I said. She said it did it voluntarily. BC nodded thoughtfully. It did. It's been doing a lot of things voluntarily. She said it without concern, in the same tone she used to describe sensor readouts. I think it's curious. The targeting system is curious. The distributed intelligence is curious, she corrected. It's not really just a targeting system anymore. It's been processing the engagement data continuously since Tuesday. It's building new tactical frameworks on its own. I looked at the component housings scattered around her on the floor. The recycled air of the engine bay. The hum of the ship's systems running their steady rhythms around us. 40 ships in a docking bay that had been built for more impressive visitors, crewed by people who had rebuilt them from nothing. Is that a problem? I asked. She considered this seriously, in the way she considered everything. I don't think so, she said. I think it's just doing what we built it to do. Which is what? She tilted her head slightly. Learning, she said. I left her to it and walked the rest of the ships as the station cycled through its artificial evening. On the Porter, the navigation crew was running drills. On the Penny, the junior crew were running simulations. On Old Bessie, someone had finally touched up the scorch marks on the external plating, though only partially, because they had run out of matching paint midway through, and had gone back to something they considered more important. On the Carver, Nora was at the tactical console when I returned to the bridge, working through the formal engagement documentation that the coalition required. She looked up when I came in. How are they? She asked. Good, I said. BC's already making improvements. She sent 3 updates to the mesh framework in the last 2 hours, Nora said. It integrated them in about 9 seconds. I sat down in my command chair and looked at the view screen. The docking corridor outside was lit with the navigation signals of a dozen different species vessels. A small galaxy of different designs and sizes, all sharing the same space with a particular negotiated piece that came from having more to lose by conflict than by coexistence. Nora, I said, do you think they understand us now? She thought about it without rushing, which was one of the things I valued most about her. Some of them, she said, the ones who are honest with themselves. The ones who can look at what happened and let it mean what it means rather than what they wish it meant. And the ones who can't, they'll figure it out eventually, she said. Or they'll have another Tuesday. I found that I had very little to add to that. The galaxy had spent a long time building weapons that looked like power. Enormous ships with mirrored hulls. Formation drills so precise they were beautiful. Energy arrays that lit up a system when they fired, putting on a light show for anyone watching from a distance. All of it designed to be seen, measured, and feared. We had spent a few years building something that did not look like anything at all. 40 cargo haulers with bad paintwork and a coolant leak, and a targeting system that had been trained on 12 million hours of competitive gaming. Data and that had learned, in the middle of a real engagement, to be curious. And somewhere in the math of that difference was a lesson that I thought the galaxy was going to be sitting with for a long time. We had never needed anyone's respect. We had needed to protect 40,000 people on a cold, rocky planet and go home with all 40 ships intact, and we had done both. But I will admit, here in the quiet of the Carver's Bridge, with the station's artificial evening settling around us and the stars doing what they always did beyond the view screen, that the silence where the laughter used to be was a profoundly comfortable thing to sit in. We had arrived carrying nothing. Nothing that looked like anything worth taking seriously. And we had left, if not yet home, then at least with the table arranged differently. 40 ships that had been garbage bins were still garbage bins. They still had dents and coolant leaks, and one of them played the wrong anthem on ceremonial occasions. None of that had changed. What had changed was what everyone in the galaxy now knew. Those bins could do when the people inside them decided they were not done. That was what $10 per vessel bought you. When the people spending it refused to be limited by the number. That was what we were.